Let me introduce our stellar guest for this evening. Dan Hannan, or Lord Hannan of Kingsclere, is an author and a columnist and a politician. He serves as International Secretary of the Conservative Party. He teaches at the University of Buckingham. He has written 9 books, including the New York Times bestseller, Inventing Freedom, How the English-Speaking Peoples Made the Modern World. He sat as a Conservative member of the European Parliament for 21 years, was an ardent Brexiteer and a founder of Vote Leave. And on a personal note, one of a key person in changing my own mind about the European Union. He and I were sparring partners at university, and eventually Daniel led me to the light side of the force.
Hallelujah.
He's also, of course, a regular columnist for, amongst others, the Sunday Telegraph, the Daily Mail, the Washington Examiner, and I think it's fair to say one of our leading intellectuals in British conservative public life. Dan, great to have you with us, my friend. How the devil are you doing from the wine cellar that you're in?
How lovely to be here, Mark, and very nice to be with everyone here. Great to see this PopCon initiative. Fantastic to be part of it.
So I don't tell Dan the exact questions I'm going to be asking in advance, but I want to sketch out the themes I'm going to be asking, not so much for Dan's benefit, but more for the benefit of the audience. Because if you ask questions along these sorts of themes, it's more likely I'll be able to weave them into our conversation better. So we'll have a little bit on what's our audit of the Labour government since July, and what more should we expect from it over the next 4 years, what's going wrong. As you know, we at PopCon talk a lot about the quangocracy. Lord Hannan talks a lot about the baristocracy, and I want to unpeel what he means by that. What do we mean by conservatism in 2024? What is actually our key lodestar that guides us? Are we experiencing a realignment in politics, and especially in party politics? Witness the rise of Reform UK at the last election and in the polls since. And what are the challenges for Kemi Badenoch and the Conservative Party to navigate a way to a return to power? So it's been 50 years since Margaret Thatcher became leader of the Conservative Party. It's been 100 days since Kemi Badenoch became leader of the Conservative Party. It's been, what is it now, just over 8 months since Keir Starmer became Labour Prime Minister. Dan, let's start there. What's your take on the 8 months of this Labour government?
Much worse than I think most people were expecting. We, I think, tended to project what we wanted onto Starmer because of the very real failings of the previous Tory government. And we tended not really to look in detail at what he'd stood for all his life. We bought, I think, the idea, because he was anti-Corbyn and ended up expelling Corbyn from the Labour Party, we thought that that represented a real shift. But actually, it didn't. And I'm as guilty as anyone else of this, right? I did not see coming the sort of pre-80s economic policy, the most basic things I just thought everyone understood, right? I mean, I thought it was commonly understood that if you raised taxes on mobile wealthy foreigners, they wouldn't just sit there waiting to be taxed. It seems to have come as a real surprise to Rachel Reeves. I thought it was understood that if you started taxing energy, not only would consumer prices go up, but energy companies would stop investing. You know, Ed Miliband was going, "Oh, I'm horrified that the Grangemouth refinery has been closed. You know, I did not see that coming." It's like, yeah, the idea that you can raise tax rates but end up with less revenue, and all of this, they seem to be kind of working out from first principles. I did not see the education stuff coming. Yes, we knew that there was going to be this vindictive VAT on school fees, the only country, with the very partial exception of New Zealand, the only country in the developed world that doesn't see education as a public good. But we didn't see the woke new curriculum, the attack on the academies, the attack on free speech on campus. All of that was nowhere flagged up in the manifesto. And then to anticipate your baristocracy point, one of the big arguments against Corbyn is that he was unpatriotic. He wasn't trusted to be on our side. But we see, whether it's from net zero through to the Chagos fiasco, we see that again and again, Starmer and Hermer and the Doughty Street matrix chambers clique that governs this country always puts Britain last.
Okay, your audit's not dissimilar to mine. I mean, I suppose the biggest surprise for me was not so much the left-wingery. They might have been a couple of shades further to the left. It's actually been the incompetence. I thought I was going to get this leftist democratic socialism, but probably relatively competently delivered, relatively well communicated and spun, even if I hated the product. But I guess it falls to me, Dan, to try and push back a bit, to be something of a devil's advocate. Given the fiscal position, given that the Tories for 14 years had just gently dialed up tax, dialed up spending, had sort of more or less given up on getting to ever getting to a balanced budget. It was always 5 years away. Surely on fiscal policy, I mean, it's actually to some considerable degree a continuation, maybe tipping up the trajectory a bit of the Sunak government, isn't it?
No, I don't really buy that. And I mean, God knows I'm a critic of a lot of the tax and spending policy under Boris and was at the time. But state spending as a proportion of GDP was falling from 2010 until the lockdown, right? We were making lots of mistakes, and I'm the first to say that, and was a big critic when it was happening. But in overall terms, it was falling. The lockdown was then an exceptional event. I think I was the first person to criticize the lockdown because I saw it coming. If any of your viewers can do any advance on February the 20th of 2020, I'm all ears. But but I don't really blame Boris particularly for that, because the whole country, apart from me, was clamoring for it, and the other parties even more. But here's the thing, right? Past Labour governments have tended to take over when the fiscal repair work has been done. There's been this cosmic unfairness, this asymmetry, where Conservative governments tend to take over in a crisis when our treasury is empty and our credit is gone, and have to do all the unpopular stuff. And then just after they've done that, the voters say, oh, I can relax, let my belt out a couple of notches, let's send for those nice socialists. And so Labour governments tend to begin with a balanced budget, or at the very least with a falling deficit. Well, not this time, because of lockdown. And I think there has been a real change. Labour inherited a fragile post-lockdown recovery, but instead of continuing the plan to try and get closer to a pre-lockdown, a February 2020 level of spending, they immediately went in the other direction. They cancelled the plans for a reduction in the civil service headcount. It was virtually the first thing they did. Then they started massively paying public sector workers more. They did that by taxing private sector workers, the one group of people they promised that they wouldn't tax. And then they wonder why the economy is shrinking. And look, I take the view, Mark, that we're in a recession now. It may not have shown up yet in the figures, but when the figures are published that reflect the period we're in now at the start of 2025, I bet you it will show that we're in a recession. And the figures are already showing that if you exclude the impact of immigration and look just at GDP per head, we are already in a recession. So no, this is something that has come since the election.
Yeah, GDP per capita is falling. Of course, that's the obvious thing to measure. I mean, if you bring in a million extra people, assuming that they have some level of activity, even if it's a tiny level of productive activity, GDP will go up. But it doesn't mean that we're getting richer per head.
Exactly so. Exactly.
So, where do you think we're going to go next? I mean, I've heard 3 scenarios, and I want to move on to what we do on our side of the aisle in a moment. But we're already seeing tensions arise between, say, Reeves and Miliband over Heathrow expansion. She seems to have won that battle, or at least that round of the battle. But looking forward to the next year, 2 years, 3 years, I've heard 3 theories. One is they'll keep doubling down on this because sooner or later, if you just throw money at public sector workers with no strings attached, apparently they'll get more productive. Perhaps they just stay in that lane and keep doubling down on government spending, and the GB energy and all of this sort of stuff will make us rich. And if it's failing, we'll throw more money at it. So more insanity. Or they do a kind of Jim Callahan style pivot. They actually say, to be frank, this isn't working. There's going to have to be a serious retrenchment of spending. Taxes are too progressive. We are seeing, capital flight and brain drain. And they actually do a U-turn with the left screaming. Or the third is they just get into a position of paralysis. They just sit there, do nothing. perhaps towards the end of their tenure, Keir Starmer announces he's got good plans on how to change A levels and ban tobacco. That's where we got to after 14 years. And they just pray for a sort of black swan event to save them. But basically nothing happens. They just become a government that responds to events rather than having any initiatives. Do you think those are the three scenarios?
Yeah, I mean, I'd put 1 and 3 in the same basic bracket, right? Because they both involve just spending more and more. Doing nothing when you're careening downhill is the same as accelerating in practice, or very close to it, right? So the question is, will they have time, and will they have the intention and the capacity? Will they have the volition and the permission to pull out of that downward collapse? You and I know, and everyone watching knows what makes an economy grow, right? What makes an economy grow is low spending, low taxes, light regulation, free trade. There's no mystery to it. It's the same formula that works every time. But getting there is unpopular in the short term, and that is the test of a government. The reason that those things are simple but not easy is that cutting spending in particular, although everyone accepts it in theory as a way of growing the economy, as soon as you get to a specific cut, there's always a blocking minority against it, right? I think it was as long ago as Eden, when he was Prime Minister, saying everyone is in favour of general economy and particular expenditure. So even Labour accepts on one level that we should get closer to the pre-COVID spending levels. In practice, there's this massive national deceit about it, right? Because the reality is that the huge increases in public spending have been in social security and in the NHS. So a politician who is not prepared to constrain those budgets doesn't really want to cut spending at all. And both sides have been in denial about this, right? On the right, people pretend that huge sums can be got from the foreign aid budget. And they spend that, in reality, tiny budget over and over again on a million different things. On the left, the equivalent is the wealth tax or a non-dom tax, right, which raises little, if anything. Both sides pretend that you can save money from cracking down on waste, as though no one's ever tried that before. The reality is that to cut, just to get back to where we were in the Blair years, would mean cutting public expenditure by about a third. And that can't be done without tackling the big ticket items like pensions and so on, right? So is Labour prepared to do that? Well, look, they are now, according to most polls, they're now at something like 25% support. Who is that 25%? That 25% is overwhelmingly people who depend on state largesse, whether as state workers, as government employees, or as benefits claimants. So I can see why Labour is hugely reluctant to cut spending, because that would be kicking away the last group of people who are still voting for them through thick and thin. But the alternative, Callaghan-like, is to destroy the economy and with it their reputation for a generation. So that isn't a particularly attractive option either. The logical thing for them is to go for your option 2, to start retrenching now before things get worse. I don't yet see any willingness to do that. And that's why we get these witch doctor cures of, oh, we can grow through more AI in the public sector, or through the customs union, or through cracking down on tax avoidance. I'll say it's all nonsense. Unless you're prepared to make the big, tough decisions of cutting spending and regulation, we will continue to get poorer.
Yeah, interesting. And let's talk a bit about the kind of core PopCon proposition, which we expound and spread. That moving away from fiscal policy, we're obviously overtaxed, the government spends too much, we're borrowing too much from our children and all of the rest of it. But we're also increasingly governed by so-called independent arm's length bodies. And perhaps you could argue, I don't know exactly how you'd measure it, a rather more politicized civil service than might have been the norm 20, 30, 40 or 50 years ago. That at least seems to be the temperature of the room. I can't prove that point. And sort of, there's a danger, isn't there, that politicians of either stripe have just become a dignified part of the constitution. We're in fact run by the sort of fiscal rules of the OBR. Whether Rachel Reeves or Jeremy Hunt is Chancellor matters, probably a bit more than a rounding error, but it doesn't matter that much. The pronouncements of the Climate Change Committee are probably, in practice, more important than the pronouncements of Ed Miliband. And then an area that you've touched on a lot has been the increased politicization of our justice system, of our legal system. Everybody talks about lefty lawyers. Well, I don't much mind if lawyers are lefty. I care whether judges are lefties, whether court judgments are becoming political. Tell us a little bit about the drift that we've seen there and whether that drift will become an avalanche under Keir Starmer et al.
Well, I mean, I don't know if avalanche is the right metaphor, because I think they're much better at stopping things. It's more like a heavy snowfall that just smothers everything, right? You look at the complaints that are coming from the Labour side against the Attorney General, Richard Herman, and they are all from the ministers who are desperate to try and pull levers to grow without cutting things, and finding that they're being told it's illegal. So there was that case a couple of weeks ago when the Rosebank refinery was ruled out of order in Scotland. Now, you know, you can be pro or anti drilling oil, right? You can say Britain must give a lead, we've got to show, or you can say, look, this is crazy. No one else is following us. And there comes a point when all we're showing the rest of the world is what to avoid, right? But either way, whichever side of that argument you're on, it's fundamentally a political decision. And this is the kind of case that wouldn't have come to court 30 years ago, right? Now it is so, it's the first response of anyone who gets a political decision they don't like, go to court, right? So you mentioned Rachel Reeves and Miliband and the Heathrow runway. The reason that Miliband is so relaxed about it is the same as the reason that all the anti-runway protesters are so relaxed about it. It's like, no, it's not going to happen, because they're going to go to court and they're going to find some friendly lefty judge who's going to say, oh, this is in violation of our Paris Agreement and whatever. So it won't get built. And this has become a real problem, that we're governed not just by an activist civil service, but by a judiciary which is legislating from the bench, which is deliberately advancing an agenda through the courts that would have been rejected in the legislature. And the first thing done by any incoming Conservative government, any government of the centre-right, is going to have to be to fix that plumbing. Otherwise, it doesn't matter what we say or do about anything else.
And what does fixing that plumbing look like? I don't know, I was about to say you're channeling Kenny Badenoch, but she talks more in electrical and engineering analogies, which you probably don't want to mix with the plumbing. But what is that fix? I get there's a structural problem, but what are at least the prerequisites to?
So there's a number of things, because I think the quangocracy and the baristocracy are very interlinked. It's part of the same. By the way, baristocracy meaning rule by lawyers, not meaning rule by baristas, who I think are superb, independent, free market, privately employed people doing hard work and paying their taxes and offering us all a service. I wouldn't mind that. But first of all, we have to repeal a lot of stuff. And some of that is easier, right? So repealing laws, the Climate Change Act, the Equality Act, the Human Rights Act, all of these, they're always referred to as Blair era, but actually most of them are Brown era. Blair was too savvy to do things that blatant in most cases, other than the Human Rights Act. But then we've got to undo his judicial reforms. I think we have to undo the Supreme Court. As soon as you create a Supreme Court, it starts getting ideas with a name like that. And starts doing things that would have been unthinkable as recently as the 90s. You then need, and I think this is the most important, you need to tackle the openings for judicial review domestically. I was very struck by a line in the judgment that overturned the Rwanda scheme, where, you know, I mean, first of all, extraordinary that happened, right? That Parliament expressly passes a law saying we declare the following policy, and the courts strike it down. But the way in which the Court of Appeal eventually struck it down, there was a line in there where they said, contrary to the principles of customary international law. Now, I don't think there's such a thing as customary international law, right? The international law exists in the form of treaties and, you know, protection of diplomats and Vienna Conventions and all that. But the idea that there's some kind of caseload that you can draw on as if it were domestic precedent is sheer invention. And that was the judge's way of saying, even if you pull out of the ECHR, and even if you pull out of the 1952 UN Convention on Refugees, we're still not going to let you deport people, because we'll claim that it's contrary to the principles of customary international law. Now, in that situation, you really do have an attempted coup. The wonderful observation that I think Michael Howard once made, that a court with a mission is a menace, but a Supreme Court with a mission is a tyranny. And we're very, very close to that point.
So and do you think also, looking at the Starmer government again, that there's now the elected government is now aligned with this, right? I mean, I've been trying to, we've highlighted a range of their domestic economic lunacies, but let's take the Chagos Islands. This is an area where I'm just bewildered. I mean, I can understand the logic behind, I don't know, trying to tax millionaires more. I don't think it will work. I think it will be counterproductive, but I can kind of see the germ of a thought of where they're coming from. I can understand them, throwing money at a particular public sector project that they're fond of. I'm against it. I don't think it will work. But again, I can see the germ of a rational idea. The Chagos Islands, what on earth is going on here?
Absolutely.
I mean, I can't explain the motive even of the government.
Unbelievable. I mean, almost literally unbelievable. No economic case, no legal case, no strategic case. There is no legal obligation to do anything of this kind, right? When we accepted the ICJ, we did so expressly on the basis that it did not have any jurisdiction in disputes between two Commonwealth countries. So there is no judgment that's telling us what to do. The economics are terrible, right? Mauritius was already paid in 1965 for renouncing its claim. It's now going to be paid an immense sum all over again for taking the islands back. And do you know what would be the most appalling tragicomic outcome for Britain? The ultimate humiliation would be if Mauritius then turned around, having pocketed the money from us, and sold the islands to Donald Trump, which I think I could well see, because Mauritius has never had any interest in these islands until the Chinese started pushing at them. There's the surrender of this critical base. So not surrender of the base, but the making of it far less secure, because who knows what's going to happen in the surrounding territory. It's been said it's the Malta of the Indian Ocean. It controls 4 of the great naval choke points in the world, from the Bab el Mandeb to the Straits of Hormuz, right, to the Malacca Cape. All of that so as to make some lefty lawyers feel warm about humiliating this country. I mean, it is the most extraordinary failure of statecraft. And I don't think you need to be on the right to be as angry about this as I am. I mean, I really do. I'm almost too angry to talk about this. It's like watching one of your children giving all their money to a religious cult. I mean, it's just a horrible, horrible thing to have to witness. But I've noticed that my Labour colleagues have gone very quiet about it. And what's bothering, I think at first they thought, oh, it's decolonisation, we like that. And they vaguely, I think, got the idea that we were letting the Chagossians go home or something. They've now realised that it's nothing of the kind. We're giving the islands to a country that's 1,300 miles away and has never had any legal claim to them. They've realised that Mauritius is going to exploit the marine conservation area that we've been keeping. But the thing that I think is really bothering them more than any of that is no future spending cut or tax rise will now go without mention of the Mauritians, right? Because the sums are so huge, £9 billion, right? So if you look at everything they've saved so far, the inheritance tax on farms, the VAT on schools, scrapping of the winter fuel allowance, that is less than 4 billion. And they're talking 9 billion as the first sum, before Mauritius then said, oh, we might double this with the interest payments, right? Every time they talk about money, people are going to say, hang on, you're giving all this to the Mauritians, for the working people. You never said the working people of Mauritius, and that is going to destroy this government unless they act very quickly and pull out of the nosedive.
Let me take a couple of questions that have come in, Dan, which have touched on a couple of themes that we've just discussed. Alistair Stratton wants to know, can the Chagos Islands be saved? I mean, an American intervention perhaps, or a realization on the Labour benches that the position, even if they don't really have any moral stake in it in their hearts, is just politically embarrassing. Where do you think we'll go from here? Will
Starmer
and Homer get their way or not?
The second of those, I think, is more likely. there was an interview, I think yesterday, Pete Hegseth was being interviewed on Fox, and he said, look, we haven't made up our minds about this, but it is quite difficult to see how the US could stop it. Short of just declaring outright that they will not recognize Mauritian sovereignty, which of course Trump might do. He's not predictable like that. But I just think that from Trump's point of view, Starmer has been so wobbly. Why would you prop up British sovereignty rather than just taking the islands from Mauritius? Which, as I say, would be the ultimate final humiliation for us. From a Trumpian point of view, it would be a nice garnish for Greenland and Panama and Canada and whatever else. And that would then leave us I mean, can you imagine a greater international humiliation than paying Mauritius again to take back the islands that we paid them to surrender any right to in the first place?
Well, I wonder whether
and then Mauritius pockets the money and says we're selling them. I mean, can you
I wonder how the sort of woke decolonization lobby would spin that. What we'd have to claim it was reparations for the 1776 war against America to a third party or something.
I mean, almost the only country that they would rather not have it than us is the US, right? So it's going to be pretty tricky for them. But no, I mean, I do think I've noticed for a while that there is a perfunctory and embarrassed tone when Labour frontbenchers defend this deal. And it really does seem to be the case that it is the baristocracy, that it's Starmer, Hermer, and Sands, the same group of lefty lawyers who almost seem to have come out of a kind of conservative fantasy from the early 2000s with these woke, unpatriotic, and fundamentally quite puerile perspectives that, we must always back the poorer country against the richer. We must always back the colony against the colonizer. We must always back the brown population against the white. And we must always back everyone else against Britain, kind of regardless of the rights and wrongs of the case. And, we see them. We see them.
So we touched on the international law here. Let's Mark Dabady, I hope I pronounced your surname correctly. This goes back to your sort of what needs to be done as and when we get a sensible government to try and reverse some of this damage. Do we need a Trump-style day one blitz, he asks, and what would this look like in a British context? Obviously, you can't, well, I suppose you could write executive orders, but they don't have the same force here. What would that sort of look like in a world in which Conservatives or a Conservative-aligned government returns to office in 2029?
Yeah, so policy-wise, you could do a lot of the same stuff, right? If we were replicating what Trump has done, we'd be massively upping deportations. We'd be sending the Royal Navy to police the Channel to stop illegal migration. We'd be scrapping bureaucracies and quangos and arm's-length bodies left, right, and centre. We'd be scrutinizing those that remain and placing them under proper parliamentary control. And we'd be closing down whole departments. There's a lot of stuff we could do. It is easier, of course, in a presidential system to do that. You have a direct mandate and you don't have the same problems of civil service resistance and judicial resistance that we have here. But that doesn't mean we can't do anything. We can use orders in council, and we should go in with a list of things ready to present to the king on day one. And this, by the way, I do worry about a feeling on the right that this is going to be simple, that it's easy. And I get this a lot from friends who vote reform. Why can't we just sort it out, show some backbone? Well, Margaret Thatcher took on the NUM and trade unions, and it was a tough slog, but she beat them. But they were an external force as far as the government was concerned. They were in receipt of government money, but they weren't actually in the civil service and embedded in the institutions of the state. Getting rid of the influence of these very wealthy, educated, and powerful interests in government is a whole different thing. We saw in Brexit how hard they were prepared to fight to prevent the referendum being implemented. Multiply that by about 4, because this time they'd be defending their own mortgages and school fees. It wouldn't just be defending their ideology, right? This would consume the energies of at least one parliamentary term. Now, that's a fight that we need to have. But let's not pretend it's going to be easy, right? Let's not pretend that this is just a sort of lack of willpower. This is going to be a huge grinding effort. Like a lot of my reform friends say, oh, why don't we just sort of turn these boats back in the Channel? Well, Boris tried that. It's not like no one had ever had the idea. Boris
Yeah.
tried, he was told by the admirals, that would be illegal, we're not going to do it. Now, if you're in government, you've got to think about things like that, right? So genuinely, to any reform friends watching, what is your plan? I'm not trying to be clever. We need to hear what is going to be the plan of the right when we get in, so that we're in a position to implement these things. And it's no good saying we're just going to be strong. We've got to have the legal texts at the ready.
So that's a neat segue into the second half of this conversation. We've got a plethora of questions on this as well, Dan. I mentioned at the top of the show that we've now had, is it 100 days of Kemi in office? What do you make of her tenure so far and the present plight of the Conservative Party, which, if you're take a studious view of the opinion polls, may have even worsened since the July the 4th shellacking that we received?
Well, they've certainly worsened on where they were, 3 months ago. I don't think they're quite as bad as, I think we're still, the broad picture, the Tories have advanced very marginally. Reform have advanced a lot and Labour have collapsed. That bothers me in this sense. If you put in the numbers to those various electoral calculus predictors, the seat projections are pretty dire from a right-wing point of view. Let's say, for the sake of, I did one the other day where I put in 25, 25, 25, which is what the poll that day had shown for Labour Conservatives reform. And then I think I did like 12 Lib Dem and 7 Green, or whatever that day's poll was. That showed Labour forming the next government, right? Tories and Reform had twice as many votes. But because of the way our first past the post system works, that means that in lots of seats, although the combined right-wing vote is much bigger than the Labour vote, those two candidates cancel each other out and Labour comes through the middle. And, this is what happened in Canada when the Conservatives and Reform were split for about 10 years. And it allows the left to rule with a very small vote share. And that, I think, I think it would be a huge failure of statecraft and patriotism from both the right of centre parties if that were allowed to happen. So I do think there needs to be some kind of rapprochement, some kind of, as we old Brussels hands say, some kind of coming together of the two right of centre parties. Now, actually, kind of logistically and geographically, this is really quite straightforward, much easier than a lot of people think. The big difference in the parties is not in their manifestos, which are really very similar. We all want lower taxes and less wokery and controlled borders and all that. It's really much more that their electorates are different. Reform came second in 98 seats in July of last year. 89 of those seats are Labour held. 60 of them are in the north of England, 17 are in Wales, right? Conversely, Reform did very, very badly in the south of England. In the patch that I used to represent in the European Parliament, they were generally a poor fourth, although that was enough to give the seats to the Lib Dems in quite a few cases. So it shouldn't be beyond the wit of man to work out a kind of pact where each party stands down in certain seats to give the other a clear run. Really, the only part of the country where we are in direct competition is a little strip of the east of England, from kind of Lincolnshire to East Kent, maybe 30 seats, 40 tops, right? The rest of the country kind of works itself out very obviously. I'm not saying we should have a full SDP liberal type alliance, just more like the DUP and the UUP sometimes did in Northern Ireland, right? Where the two of them said, yes, each of us is the other's rival, arguably the other's chief rival, but there are some seats where the two of us standing would be so foolish and would let somebody in that we really don't like. Let's be grown up about this. And I think if we didn't do that and Labour things may change, but if we're anything like where we are at the moment in the polls and we go into the next election and put Labour in on a very, very low share of the national vote, I think that supporters of both parties would be very disappointed. They would find it very hard to forgive the leaders who delivered that, and I think the leaders wouldn't deserve to be forgiven.
But we might, have a good 2 or 3 years of shadow boxing before we get to that point. Presumably, Kemi wants to score a knockout against Nigel. Nigel wants to score a knockout against Kemi. If either of those happens, do your own research, work out your own bookies odds. Well, then fine, it's all a moot point. One party evaporates or collapses into the other. It's only really if we stay in this sort of nip and tuck sort of position in which the ratio of votes between the parties is either 1-to-1 or between 1-to-1 and 2-to-1 or 3-to-1, I guess.
Float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, sure, except I think both parties have a flaw beyond which they're not going to sink, right? There is a hardcore of reform voters who I think have made up their minds not to vote Conservative because they're so angry about the last government. And there is equally embedded in rural England and in a chunk of suburban England a mass of Tory support, which is not going to go anywhere else. And so the idea of one party completely displacing the other, I think, is unrealistic. And one, we need to work with that. I would also say, I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of people watching now who are saying, well, fine what you're saying about lower taxes and controlled borders, but I'll never believe you again after what you did in office and da 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 da. And I'm not really. I mean, of course, there are some excuses. There always are. There was a pandemic. But and of course, this very left-wing civil service. But yeah, the Tories definitely made mistakes. I mean, I'm not going to deny that for a moment, and I didn't deny it at the time. I would just say, this being the anniversary of Margaret Thatcher, wouldn't it have been a very odd thing to have said in 1979? I'm never going to vote for the Tories because of what Edward Heath did, or to have said in 1945, I'm never going to vote for the Tories because of what Baldwin did, bloody lefty, right? It does seem a strange thing to rule out on principle without even looking at what the party stands for at the next election, to rule out on principle ever voting for them because of something that's in the past.
Okay, and then I suppose there's an overarching theme I wanted to put to you. And then there's a few questions around the tactics around that appear to be sympathetic to your point of view and mine, that some sort of peace agreement between the two parties might well be a necessity to save the nation from disaster. But do you think that here's a hypothesis. Do you think that the Conservative Party in 2025 is still a meaningful coalition? That what may have happened is that the issues that are now to the fore of British politics are very different to those of 30, 40, 50 years ago. So even if various different brands of Tories can all say, well, I still consider myself a Conservative, the practical impact of that is that you have a divided party. I mean, most obviously Brexit, right? Now, I mean, that was batted to the electorate. So to that extent, didn't directly matter. Then the Brexiteers won with Boris. General election was effectively referendum too. But nevertheless, Conservatives of good faith split straight down the middle. You might argue this, mightn't you? That, in the 70s and the 80s, the Conservatives, the main issues were, where do you sort of stand on the Cold War, nuclear weapons, trade unions, being basically pro-enterprise, supportive of the institutions of Britain, such as the police and the army, and wet Tories and dry Tories, whatever their differences philosophically or below the surface, would have been united around that. Big issues today seem to me about, where do you broadly stand on global institutions? So we've had Brexit, ECHR's at the front now. I don't think it'll be long before the World Health Organization. Should we, pull out from that? What do we even think of the UN? Immigration, closely linked to that. Carbon net zero, which, as you rightly say, was, basically Conservative pioneered. These big issues, wokery, whatever you mean by that, what do we make of the whole sort of trans debate? Suddenly, with these issues at the fore, there seem to be a multitude of diverse opinions amongst the people who find themselves in the Conservative Party. How much of a problem is that? I mean, Jeff Mitchell asks, why have we as a party allowed our parliamentary to move so far away from Tory beliefs? Chris Penny points out, Lord Froster said the Conservatives need to purge Liberal MPs from the party. How and when will this be brought about? And then I suppose attached to that, although I don't want to put words into anybody's mouth, neither yours nor Kemi Badenoch's, Simon Deere asks, would Dan agree that Kemi's defiant, even proud refusal to talk policy has created a vacuum that reform have rushed in to fill? And I'm not suggesting anything other than sincerity on her part, But might there be a case that I've just watched before her trigonometry interview, lengthy 1 hour interview on the trigonometry podcast. I just wonder somewhere in her subconscious, she's not taking a clear line on ECHR or carbon net zero, because if she takes a clear line, 1/3 or 1/2 of the party will go bananas. Are we actually a sustainable coalition for the big issues of 2025?
Yeah. I mean, first of all, I think I'm not sure. I think that half or a third of the party will go bananas. I mean, this is the party that put her and Robert Jenrick into the final, right? The parliamentary party that did so, and I think the members, are fairly solid in their views against government by global technocracy. I think Theresa May's premiership was pretty calamitous, and the climate change legislation she passed was pretty cataclysmic. But to be fair, the Tories didn't start that. That started with the last Blair government, unless you count Margaret Thatcher making her speech at the UN in 1988, right? But look, I mean, let me take your big question mark about what does it mean to be a conservative now? What does the party believe in? I've been reading a lot about the history of the whole Tory as well as Conservative Party. If you count the Tory prelude rather than just the Conservative Party from Robert Peel in the 1834 Tamworth Manifesto, we are a very, very old party. By some measure, the oldest party in the world, right? So the word Tory is being used in 1679. The second oldest party of the US Democrats, only going back to 1828, right? So we are vastly older than anybody else. Have there been core beliefs that have actuated us through those 3.5 centuries with incredibly different circumstances, divisions that now seem bizarre to us, right, over Catholic emancipation or Rhodesian sanctions or whatever it is? Yes, I think there have been. First of all, a belief in established institutions, national established institutions. Initially the monarchy and the Church of England, but that then grew into a belief in army regiments, county councils, etc., right? I think we are believers that as conservatives, we have a repairing lease on the institutions that we've been lucky enough to inherit from our parents. We have a duty to pass them on in an improved condition to our children. Second, there is a genuine patriotism, that people are not afraid about asserting the national interest over vague global humanitarian principles. This was as true when we were fighting Napoleon as now. I wondered on that second one whether I could really push it back to the early Tories, and I think I can. When the Church and King party got going in exile after defeat in the Civil War, there were various offers by other countries to restore Charles II with military force, by Sweden, by France, by others. And Clarendon, who was then the Church and King leader, I would say that the godfather of what became the Tory party, he took a very recognizable Tory attitude. No, we don't want to come in with foreign weaponry behind us. This is our issue to solve as a country. We will solve it according to our own temper and our own attitudes, and we will then rule as Englishmen, right? So I think the reason I stress that, the reason I stress the importance of patriotism as expressed through established institutions, is I think that contains the answer to what you were saying about, the WHO and the Paris Agreement and so on. That order, which kind of dates from, I guess, from the middle of the Second World War in the West, right, with the Atlantic Charter and so on, but really only became supreme in the 1990s, has come to an end, because it rested ultimately on a willingness of the United States to defend it with force of arms. And the US has torn it up, right? All of that is over. It's not just that Trump is withdrawing from the climate accords and the WHO and may well withdraw from NATO, the UN. I mean, would we really be surprised, right? It's that he's backed away from the principles on which that post-war order rested. Principles like not changing borders by force, settling disputes by arbitration, and preferring democracies to autocracy, right? And there are real dangers in this, right? I am deeply uncomfortable when I see him threatening Denmark and Canada and other NATO allies. But my point is that it's not going to be credible for us to be the last people who are still loyal to an international order that has disappeared. It's not there anymore. Loyal to what, right? Somebody was brilliantly pointing out the other day, which I'd forgotten, that the hero, the romantic hero of Bridget Jones 2 is a human rights lawyer. I mean, how unimaginable that would be today, right? And he's made all the sexier because he's violating some country's sovereignty to bring some warlord to justice. Now human rights lawyers are the rogues who stand up for every prisoner, every illegal immigrant, every scoundrel, everyone except the law-abiding victims of crime, right? You couldn't make that film. The rest of the world has worked that out. When Trump pulls the plug on it, everyone makes their dispositions accordingly. We alone, because of Harmer, there's a Hermer and Starmer, Harmerism, right? The Harmers of this
They
world.
do sound like
We
a
alone
comedy
are trapped
duo.
in this bloody early 90s Richard Curtis movie of still thinking that we can govern the country according to these abstract human rights principles. Now, if there is one thing that Toryism and then more recently conservatism has been solidly against, it has been the absurdity of these pretended universal principles over our own interests. And I can do no better than to quote Disraeli on this when he was asked about it. He said, "To the liberalism that they profess, I prefer the liberty that we enjoy to the rights of man, the rights of Englishmen," right? In other words, forget all these abstract paper rights. What counts is our own institutions and our own structures as developed and inherited from our own fathers.
Really interesting. And do you think then that is what you've just said would, command 99% support amongst the Conservative Parliamentary Party, for example?
I don't know about 99, but yeah, it's definitely the settled view of most of them, right? What happens is that the dissidents always get massive publicity simply because they are the dissidents. I sometimes think that there is a semi-constitutional position for the anti-conservative conservative, right? Like it was Dominic Grieve for a long time, then it was Saida Varsi, and they get a special chair at the BBC. Do you know what
Michael Heseltine, above all
else? Oh,
else.
if you go back far enough, Michael Heseltine held the, maybe the Muhammad Ali of anti-conservative conservatives, right, for a long time. So, and they're irritating people, right, very often, the sort of Anna Soubryism, right? So they are eye-catching and not in a good way. But that doesn't make them numerous. And to name a dozen irritating people, most of the people I've mentioned have left, by the way, gives, I think, a very false impression. I think the vast majority of conservatives are fundamentally there because we are a national party. And on the specific issue of the ECHR, I'd be astonished if we don't go into the next election on a repeal position. But I would again just make the point that I was making earlier about the importance of getting stuff done, right? We shouldn't confuse ends and means. Leaving the ECHR should not be an end in itself. The end is controlling our borders and being able to kick people out of the country when they're not allowed to be here, right? I suppose it is conceivable that you could do that in some other way. Like, for example, if you've got a gang of European countries together and said you have to amend it in the following ways or we're all leaving or something. So you could, but much more realistically, what if we left and then we still couldn't control our borders, right? What if we left and then still found that there was too much judicial activism to deport scoundrels? And that's why I think it's not fair to demand policy in that level of detail now. Yeah, by all means, there should be a clear direction of travel. And I think Kemi she should say more about her principles and her vision. But the exact way of controlling our borders, how we undo the Blair judicial reforms, etc., it is much, much more serious, bigger and more detailed than saying, oh, let's just leave the ECHR. And I think we do people a disservice when we pretend that it can all be done with a wave of a wand.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. I don't disagree with that. But I just wonder whether I could offer an addendum. I don't think that anybody, so a criticism of Kemi thus far, but she's sticking to her guns, and you've very articulately enunciated her strategic position, is all of this will come in the due course of time. Politicians owe it to the public to come forward with well thought out ideas rather than just be issuing permanent announcements to fit the media cycle. And all of that seems to me well and good. And I would also agree that a commitment to leave the ECHR probably begs as many questions as it answers. Or to say I'm against carbon net zero by 2050 also begs a whole load of questions. Such positions are not policies, in my view. They are a sort of roadmap of where you want to go. That's still pretty clear. You don't pretend that just abolishing this and scrapping that will be the answer to our prayers. And an unsympathetic person might say that Nigel Farage and Reform trade on that a bit. Here's a checklist of 10 things and then all will be well. Some might also argue that Brexit nearly unravelled because of that. So we must leave the European Union, but what do we do afterwards? I know there's many people to blame there. But what I'm sort of trying to work out is, what more information or evidence do you want before you decide whether you think we should be in ECHR or not?
Well, actually,
have a
in a
million
way,
different views about what we do afterwards. What more evidence
yeah.
do you want before you decide whether you're committed to the carbon?
Sure.
The jury's in my view, even if there's then a huge discussion to be had about what some 300-page detailed peer-reviewed policy document might look like.
Right. So I think Brexit is a very good example of that, right? There was a detailed plan for what to do, and it took the form of that million-word doorstopper of a document, Change or Go, produced by Vote Leave, which was, in immense detail, how to use our freedoms in energy policy, in defense policy, tax policy, you name it, agriculture, fisheries. It was all. The trouble was, the government was then led by someone who'd voted Remain and was incapable of making decisions, and really did think that she could govern by slogan. Brexit means Brexit, and I intend to make a success of it. Well, forgive me, but that is the exact equivalent of what some people are doing now. We'll just, kick out the immigrants and stop woke. I mean, you do need to have some realistic plan, because making those promises and then failing to deliver again, I think would be cataclysmic, right? So, but I do agree with you. I think Kemi should be doing more to set out a general sense of direction, right? So, for example, you could say, we don't like the ECHR. We think that we have a very good British Bill of Rights dating to 1689. We could maybe, update that a little bit. The 1689 Bill of Rights is a wonderful document, and as you know, I am a Whig and Williamite politician. But even I concede that it probably has a little bit too much to say about, keeping Catholics out of power, and too little to say about personal freedom and free speech and all the rest of it. So we could, it would be fine. I would like to hear a Conservative leader say, rather than having the ECHR, we'll have some kind of British Bill of Rights, and it will be a guarantee of parliamentary supremacy against judicial activism. I wouldn't want detailed policy at this stage.
No, nobody does that. Nobody
and in
does.
the same way, but I just think this is important. In the same way, I favour reform of the House of Lords, right? I'm on board with a policy that says we will have some kind of democratic upper house, but we'll have a royal commission and we'll look at the details and whatever. But why I think this matters is there are, as we were saying, two competing parties on the right. And the Reform Party does put very detailed numbers on things, but it's plucking them out of a hat. We're going to cut corporation tax by this, we're going to cut income tax by that, without any indication at all of where it's going to come from. And again, I just think that is a disservice. By the way, another reason why the two right of centre parties would gel so well. Reform Nigel anyway, bringing the energy and the charisma. But I don't think Nigel has ever claimed that he's interested in policy, right? In all the years we served, we were elected on the same day in the same region we served until the same day, 21 years. I don't think I ever saw him express any interest in the detail of policy. That's not his forte. His forte is, the way of anticipating public opinion and articulating what people feel. Wouldn't it be great to ally that energy and that sense of enterprise with a party that is capable of staffing an entire government with competent ministers? Isn't that what we should be getting at some kind of approximation of the two things?
Yeah, interesting. I agree with that, Dan. You wrote a great piece in the Telegraph, however, saying why I think you feared that it wouldn't come about, even though it seems on the face of it both logical and, as you were saying earlier, not particularly difficult to geographically assign. The broad outlines of a deal would would present themselves really are pretty clear on the face of it. Why do you think so few people are actually sort of now advocating this? And Reform seems completely dead against it. I mean, they're not sort of saying, well, look, we're ahead in the opinion polls now, get back to us 3 weeks before polling day. No circumstances whatsoever. Kenny saying no circumstances whatsoever. I mean, if what you imagine is a very close secular friendship or some platonic relationship, possibly even marriage, you'd think by this stage we'd have to be going out on a few dates with each other, wouldn't we?
Yeah, I mean, if we were all, data from Star Trek, we'd have done the deal by now. It's easily done logically, but human beings are not emotionless androids. First of all, personal jealousies get in the way and personal rivalries. Second, we're all prone as human beings to optimism bias. Very senior figure in Reform told me, oh, we're going to get at least 400 seats at the next election. I liked the "at least." I thought that was a very good touch, but I could see he meant it, right? He talked himself into actually thinking this. And so there are all of those issues. And I think in the end, I remember Nigel, when we were in Brussels, he would talk often of the Canada precedent, meaning the Canadian election of 1993, when the Conservative Party of Canada famously went from being in government to going down to just 2 seats. Well, okay, that then led to what he wants, which is the Reform Party of Canada taking over the Tory Party of Canada. Stephen Harper came from the Reform Party. The excellent Pierre Poilievre comes from the Reform Party. So the Canadian Tories were definitely the junior partner there, and he's got that in mind. But that's not what happened in the 2024 election in the UK, right? A party with 121 MPs is not just going to meekly volunteer to be taken over by a party with 5 MPs. And that's why there has to be something, I think, more even and more mutually beneficial.
And I mean, it would be helpful if that just started with, a bit of more general respect and courtesy, possibly, a little bit of joint working in the House of Commons, just some sort of friendliness rather than arguing about each other's membership figures, which I know everybody blames Kemi for, but it was also a bit sort of up yours from Reform as well, right? That just seemed to me to be, two parties completely at war rather than actually having anything approaching a civilized.
Isn't that very telling, Mark, right? Isn't that what Freud called the narcissism of small differences, right? Because they don't fundamentally disagree about lower taxes, strong defense, patriotism, strong borders, etc., etc. They end up having this ludicrous row about who has more members. It's the ultimate sort of squalid, petty, tiny row, right? Which reflected, I think, badly on everybody. But I have to say, I don't know the unexpected victor in Essex, but the other Reform MPs, Rupert Lowe, I knew in the European Parliament. I think he's a very sensible man, very impressive politician, and a very reasonable fellow. Lee Anderson, we all knew as a colleague. Richard Tice, I've always found a perfectly reasonable guy to deal with. So I don't think there should be any obstacle to working together as politicians. And I think if we fall into the habit of doing that, all sorts of possibilities will be open. By the way, just one thought, because you may have picked up that I've been reading a lot about Tory history. I have in mind a project to write the entire story of the Tory party from 1680 to the present. One thing that is a repeating pattern there is we're very good at absorbing other parties. Coupon liberals, liberal unionists, Whigs, whatever, right? In Canada, Reform was, as I said, obviously the senior party. They provided the entire leadership of the merged party. What was left of the old Tory party in Canada just fell in behind them. But what's that party called now, right? It's the Conservative Party of Canada. And if you look on their party website, when do they say they were founded, right? They don't claim that they were founded in 2015. They claim they were founded in 1867, right? So on whatever terms this merger happens, I'm pretty relaxed about the survival of the brand in some way, because I think there is always going to be that national bit of our political system, that space for the people who elevate the national above the sectional.
Dan, we're right on the clock. I just want to finish with one question, which is, how optimistic are you that a sound, sensible, right of centre government, whatever the exact name on the tin or electoral arrangements are, will come to office by 2029 and replace this ghastly administration? Or do you think it's actually way in the balance, and we might, all of us on this call might be a bit like your reform friend who think, at least 400 seats in the bag? I mean, I always say if you ask candidates in any election what share of the vote they each think they're going to get, it always adds up to north of 200%.
Exactly.
So are you feeling, you've obviously helped us plot a path as to how we might get there and the platform that we could run on and how it needs to be detailed by the time we get there. Do you think this is going to happen, or do you actually think we could have a decade of Labour government with a majority this sizable? That's often what one would expect.
We absolutely could have. I mean, you're right about people's optimism bias. When I was an MEP, I was an election observer in loads of places all over the world. And I never came across a candidate who said, do you know what? I think the polls are being a bit too generous to me. I think I'm going to underpoll quite badly what the polls are. I've never once heard that, right? So you can see why this could happen. And of course, Starmer is praying for it, right? The last election allowed him to have a record majority with barely a third of the popular vote. And he could cling on to a bare majority or a minimum, or at the very least, a minority government with as little as 24, 25%, if our votes remain split in the way that they're currently indicating, which I think is a pretty dire situation. And this isn't just hypothetical, right? So after that election in Canada, the two parties remained split for more than a decade, and the Liberals stayed in office with a declining and, by the end, paltry share of the vote, because the Canadians have the same first past the post voting system that we do. Now, with that example before our eyes, and it's definitely before Nigel's eyes, as I say, he's spoken about it often, we really have no excuse. And I think if we let people down for reasons of petty jealousies and ambitions, we wouldn't be forgiven, and we wouldn't deserve it.
Yeah, and it's been a great pleasure again. Thanks so much for joining us. Thanks for everyone on the call. I got through as many of your questions as I could. I tried to batch together as many as I could, but a real pleasure to hear from you, Dan, and more power to your elbow. Seems to me you've sketched a philosophical, policy-driven, and historically based pathway back to power. So I'm really, really grateful to you, and look forward to catching up with you again in person. Just before I let our audience go, a reminder of our upcoming PopConversations. Next Tuesday, we've got the political strategist and polling expert James Frayne from Public First. He'll join us to discuss what to make of the recent polls, not just the headline numbers, but digging in behind them. Why are people flocking to reform? How might they switch back to the Conservatives? What needs to be done? There are details of that in the chat box. You can click on the link and register if you haven't already. And then coming up on Monday, the 3rd of March, I'll be joined in conversation by Tim Montgomery, Mr. Conservative, as he was once badged. But of course, he's recently switched to Reform UK. So I'll be asking what motivated that move, whether he's enjoying it or already has buyer's remorse. And a similar theme to tonight, how might the parties come together? And just an eye-opener further down the road, be on March the 10th. Details will be in our newsletter, of course. Lee Rowley, Kemi Badenoch's Chief of Staff, has agreed to have a pop conversation with us as well. So much happening, much to discuss. Thanks. We've had, I think, more than 150 of you on this call. Thanks for attending. Thanks for your questions. Apologies I couldn't get through all of them. But my biggest thanks once again to Lord Hannan. Dan, always a pleasure. Thanks so much for your time, your thoughts and your leadership.
And thanks to you, Mark, and thanks for everything you're doing. And thanks to Andrew and all the people at PopCon and to Annunciata. It's a great initiative.
Bless you all. Have a good night. Over and out.